Imagine finding out that your boss, who you've been criticizing every single day, has been sitting right next to you for weeks, pretending to be just another regular employee. This is the incredible true story of a multi-millionaire CEO who disguised himself as a junior programmer in his own company to discover what his employees really thought about him. And what he found was absolutely shocking. In this story you're about to hear, you'll see how one simple decision to spy on his own employees completely transformed a $100 million company. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? And if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, hit that subscribe button right now. Marcus Thompson adjusted his cheap tie and straightened his thrift store blazer as he walked through the gleaming glass doors of Pinnacle Tech Solutions. To everyone around him, he was just another new hire, a mid-level software developer joining the company's growing engineering team. His resume listed him as Marcus T. Johnson, a modest programmer with 5 years of experience at smaller firms. What his co-workers didn't know was that Marcus Thompson owned every single brick, every computer, and every coffee machine in the building. The idea had started as a joke during a board meeting 6 months earlier. "I wonder what our employees really think about this company," Marcus had mused to his CFO, Sarah Chen. "Not what they tell us in meetings or surveys, but what they actually say when they think no one important is listening." Sarah had laughed, suggesting he go undercover like those reality TV shows. But the more Marcus thought about it, the more intrigued he became. He'd built Pinnacle from nothing into a $100 million tech company, but somewhere along the way, he'd lost touch with the day-to-day reality of his employees. So here he was, carrying a beat-up laptop bag and wearing scuffed shoes, ready to spend the next few months as just another face in the crowd. He'd had his assistant create a completely fabricated identity, complete with references from shell companies he'd quietly established. The only people who knew his true identity were Sarah and his head of HR, Janet Morrison, who had been sworn to absolute secrecy. Even his own security team believed he was on an extended business trip to the European offices. As Marcus approached the reception desk, his heart pounded with nervous excitement. The receptionist, a young woman named Kelly whom he'd hired personally 2 years ago, smiled warmly at him. "You must be Marcus Johnson. Welcome to Pinnacle. I'm Kelly, and I'll be helping you get settled in today." She handed him a visitor's badge and a folder full of orientation materials. "Janet will be down in just a moment to start your onboarding process." Marcus nodded, trying to suppress a smile. This was already surreal, being welcomed to his own company as if he'd never seen the place before. He glanced around the lobby, taking in the expensive marble floors, the modern art pieces he'd personally selected, and the motivational quotes etched into the walls. One of them read, "Innovation happens when great minds collaborate." He'd written that himself during the company's early days, though now it felt oddly hollow as he prepared to spy on his own team. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual. Marcus had always taken his private executive elevator, but now he was crammed into the regular employee elevator with 5 other people. He listened to their casual conversations about weekend plans and office gossip, realizing he'd never actually heard his employees talk this way. There was an ease and authenticity to their interactions that he'd never witnessed during formal meetings or company events. When Janet appeared, Marcus almost didn't recognize her outside of her usual boardroom setting. She wore a more casual outfit and seemed relaxed in a way he'd never seen during their executive meetings. "Marcus Johnson, right? Great to meet you. I'm Janet, head of HR. Ready for your first day at Pinnacle." She winked so subtly that only he would notice, and Marcus realized this charade was going to be more challenging than he'd anticipated. The orientation process was both fascinating and mortifying for Marcus. He sat through presentations about company culture and values that he himself had crafted, now delivered by HR representatives who spoke about him as if he were some distant, mysterious figure. "Our CEO, Marcus Thompson, founded this company with a vision of creating technology that changes lives," Janet explained to the small group of new hires. "He's currently expanding our European operations, but his influence is felt in every corner of this organization." Marcus fought the urge to laugh as a fellow new hire, a young programmer named David, whispered, "I heard Thompson is a real slave driver. My friend worked here last year and said the guy expects miracles on impossible deadlines." Another new hire, Susan, nodded in agreement. "I also heard he's completely out of touch with what actually happens down here in the trenches." Typical rich CEO who's never actually had to code under pressure. The casual character assassination continued throughout the day. During the lunch break, Marcus found himself sitting with his new teammates in the cafeteria, a space he designed to be welcoming and collaborative, complete with subsidized gourmet meals and comfortable seating areas. But as he listened to conversations around him, he realized his employees saw things very differently than he'd intended. "The food's great, I'll give them that," said Rachel, a senior developer who'd been with the company for 3 years. "But it feels like they're trying to keep us here all the time. Like, why else would they put a gym, dry cleaning, and even a nap room in the building? They want us to never leave." Her colleague Mike nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. It's all about squeezing more hours out of us. Thompson probably thinks if we never go home, we'll work 24 hours a day." Marcus felt his stomach drop. The amenities he'd been so proud of, the ones that cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, were being interpreted as manipulative tactics rather than genuine employee benefits. He'd thought he was creating a workplace paradise, but his employees saw it as a gilded cage designed to exploit their time. The technical onboarding was equally revealing. Marcus was assigned to Team Delta, led by a project manager named Jennifer Liu, whom he'd promoted to her position just 8 months earlier. Jennifer was competent and well-organized, but Marcus was shocked to discover how she spoke about upper management when she thought no one important was listening. "Look, Marcus," she said, using his fake first name, "the executives in this company live in a fantasy world. They promise clients features that are physically impossible to deliver in the time frames they set. Then they act surprised when we tell them we need more time or resources." As the day progressed, Marcus was assigned his first project, a module for a client application that he knew had been personally promised by his sales team just 2 weeks earlier. The deadline was aggressive, and the specifications were vague. Watching his team struggle to interpret requirements that had clearly been written by someone with no technical understanding, Marcus began to see the disconnect between his executive suite and the actual work being done. His cubicle was in the middle of the engineering floor, surrounded by dozens of programmers, designers, and project coordinators. The energy was different here than in the executive offices. People were focused, collaborative, and genuinely passionate about their work, but there was also an undercurrent of frustration and cynicism that Marcus had never detected during his formal company visits. Developers complained about outdated equipment, unrealistic deadlines, and management decisions that made their jobs unnecessarily difficult. By the end of his first day, Marcus felt like he'd been living in a parallel universe. The company he thought he'd built, innovative, employee-friendly, and collaborative, existed mainly in boardroom presentations and marketing materials. The real Pinnacle Tech Solutions was more complicated, with hard-working employees who felt disconnected from leadership and suspicious of corporate motives. As he packed up his borrowed laptop and prepared to leave, Marcus realized this experiment was going to be far more educational than he'd ever imagined. 3 weeks into his undercover assignment, Marcus had settled into a routine that felt both familiar and completely foreign. He woke up in the modest downtown apartment he'd rented under his fake identity, took public transportation to work, and clocked in at exactly 9 a.m. like every other employee. The experience of being just another worker bee in his own corporate hive was proving more enlightening than any consultant report or employee survey he'd ever commissioned. His programming skills, rusty from years of executive work, were slowly returning. Marcus found himself genuinely enjoying the technical challenges, even if the projects were frustrating due to poor planning and unrealistic expectations from above. His team had accepted him as a reliable, if somewhat quiet, colleague. They appreciated that he didn't complain much and often worked late to help meet deadlines, though they attributed his dedication to being the new guy trying to prove himself. The most shocking revelation came during Team Delta's weekly status meeting. Jennifer Liu was on a video call with the sales director, explaining why a particular feature couldn't be delivered on time. Marcus watched as the sales director, someone he'd hired personally and considered a trusted executive, dismissed the technical concerns with obvious irritation. "Look, Jennifer, I don't want to hear about technical limitations. I already promised the client this feature would be ready. Figure it out, or I'll find a team that can." After the call ended, Jennifer turned to her team with barely contained frustration. "This is exactly what I was talking about, people. They promise things without consulting us, then act like we're incompetent when we explain reality." She pointed to a whiteboard covered with project timelines. See this schedule? It was created by someone who's never written a line of code in their life. But somehow, we're the problem when we can't deliver magic. Marcus felt a mix of anger and embarrassment. He realized that his executive team was creating promises his technical teams couldn't keep, then blaming the developers for the resulting failures. The communication gap between sales and engineering was wider than he'd ever imagined, and his own leadership style had apparently contributed to this toxic dynamic. During lunch breaks, Marcus made it a point to sit with different groups of employees, gradually building a mental map of the company's real culture. The marketing team complained about being excluded from product development decisions until the last minute, then being expected to create compelling campaigns for features they barely understood. The customer service representatives dealt daily with angry clients whose expectations had been set by over-promising sales teams. The facilities staff worked nights and weekends to maintain the office amenities, but felt invisible and undervalued by management. One particularly eye-opening conversation occurred with David, the young programmer who'd made negative comments about Marcus during orientation. They were working late on a particularly challenging bug fix, and David opened up about his career aspirations. "You know what's frustrating about this place?" he said, staring at his screen. "We do incredible technical work, but Thompson and his executive team get all the credit. I've been here for 2 years, and I've never even seen the guy. He's like this mythical figure who shows up in company newsletters and all-hands meetings via video call." Marcus probed carefully. "What would you want to say to him if you had the chance?" David laughed bitterly. "I'd tell him to spend 1 week doing the actual work instead of just talking about synergy and innovation in board meetings. I'd show him what it's like to debug code at midnight because his sales team promised impossible delivery dates. I'd explain how demoralizing it is to pour your heart into a project, only to have some executive take credit for your work in client presentations." The conversation continued for another hour, with David detailing specific instances where management decisions had made employees' jobs harder or less fulfilling. Marcus took mental notes of every complaint, every suggestion, and every moment of genuine frustration. He was building a comprehensive picture of his company's problems, but also discovering solutions that his employees had already identified. They just had no way to communicate them up the corporate hierarchy. As the weeks passed, Marcus began to see patterns in the dysfunction. His executive team, isolated in their corner offices and conference rooms, had lost touch with the daily reality of running the business. They made decisions based on spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations, without understanding the human cost of their choices. Meanwhile, his employees, smart, dedicated, and full of good ideas, felt voiceless and undervalued, leading to the cynicism and frustration he encountered daily. By his 6th week undercover, Marcus had witnessed enough workplace dysfunction to fill a management textbook, but nothing prepared him for the crisis that erupted on a rainy Thursday morning. Team Delta had been working around the clock for 2 weeks to deliver a crucial software update for Pinnacle's largest client, Megacorp Industries. The project had been mismanaged from the start, with unrealistic deadlines, shifting requirements, and inadequate resources. A perfect storm of executive incompetence that Marcus was now experiencing from the ground level. The morning started with Jennifer Liu calling an emergency team meeting. Her usually composed demeanor was cracking under pressure. "I just got off a call with the executive team," she announced to the gathered programmers, designers, and analysts. "They're threatening to replace our entire team if we don't deliver the Megacorp update by Friday afternoon." She paused, looking around the room at faces that ranged from exhausted to openly angry. "That gives us 36 hours to complete work that should take at least 2 weeks. Marcus watched as his colleagues processed this impossible ultimatum. These were the same people he'd been working alongside for weeks. Dedicated professionals who regularly stayed late, skipped lunch breaks, and went above and beyond to deliver quality work. Now they were being threatened with termination because executives had made promises that defied the laws of physics and software development. David, who had become something of a friend to Marcus, stood up with unconcealed rage. "This is insane. We've been telling management for weeks that this timeline was impossible. We've shown them the technical specifications, explained the dependencies, and documented every roadblock. But instead of listening to us, they kept promising Megacorp features that don't exist yet." His voice rose as weeks of frustration boiled over. And now we're the scapegoats for their complete failure to understand their own business? The room erupted in similar expressions of anger and disbelief. Sarah Kim, a senior developer with 10 years of experience, pointed to her computer screen showing weeks of overtime logs. "I've worked 60-hour weeks for the past month. My kids barely remember what I look like. And for what?" So some executive can blame us when their impossible promises fall apart. Other team members shared similar stories of personal sacrifice and professional dedication being met with threats and blame. Marcus felt physically sick. These weren't abstract employees complaining about minor inconveniences. These were real people whose lives had been disrupted by decisions made in boardrooms where their perspectives were never considered. He thought about all the executive meetings where teams were discussed as resources to be optimized rather than human beings with families, aspirations, and legitimate expertise. Jennifer tried to maintain order, but the situation was spiraling beyond her control. "Look, I know this is unfair," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I've escalated our concerns repeatedly, but the executive team won't budge. They keep saying we need to think outside the box and push boundaries. They don't seem to understand that software development has actual constraints." Marcus couldn't stay silent any longer. "What if we went directly to Marcus Thompson?" he suggested, trying to keep his voice steady. Maybe if the CEO understood the real situation, he could override the other executives. The suggestion was met with bitter laughter from around the room. "Thompson," David scoffed. "That guy lives in his ivory tower. He probably doesn't even know this project exists. Besides, when was the last time anyone at our level actually spoke to him? He's too busy making strategic decisions and attending conferences to care about the people who actually build his products." Rachel, who had been quietly working through the discussion, looked up from her computer. "I heard from someone in accounting that Thompson makes more in a day than most of us make in a year. You think he cares if we all get fired? He'll just hire cheaper replacements and tell investors he's optimizing human capital." The comment drew nods of agreement from around the room. Marcus felt each word like a physical blow. His employees saw him as a distant, greedy figure who viewed them as expendable resources. The worst part was that their perception wasn't entirely unfair. He had been making decisions in isolation, focused on financial metrics and strategic objectives while losing sight of the human impact of his choices. As the meeting dissolved into smaller groups of employees strategizing about impossible deadlines, Marcus stepped outside for air. He found himself in the parking garage, looking up at the building that represented his life's work. From the outside, Pinnacle Tech Solutions looked like a success story, a gleaming monument to innovation and entrepreneurship. But Marcus now knew the truth. His company was built on the backs of talented, dedicated people who felt unseen, unheard, and unvalued by the leadership team he had assembled. That evening, Marcus sat in his modest temporary apartment, staring at his laptop screen and grappling with a decision that would change everything. The Megacorp deadline loomed just hours away. His team was working frantically on an impossible task, and his executive team remained blissfully unaware of the chaos they had created. For the first time in his career, Marcus Thompson was seeing his company through the eyes of the people who actually made it run. He opened his secure laptop, the one connected to his real identity, and began reviewing 6 weeks of notes he'd been secretly compiling. The document had grown into a comprehensive indictment of Pinnacle's management culture, complete with specific examples of dysfunction, employee feedback, and solutions that his ground-level colleagues had already identified. What struck him most was how many problems could be solved with better communication and more respect for employee expertise. Marcus had always prided himself on being a hands-on CEO, but he realized his definition of hands-on had been limited to high-level strategy sessions and client presentations. He had never actually touched the day-to-day work that generated his company's revenue. His employees weren't lazy or incompetent. They were struggling against a system that set them up to fail, then blamed them for the inevitable failures. At 11 p.m., his phone buzzed with a text from David, still at the office trying to work miracles. "This is probably my last week here, so thanks for being a decent teammate while it lasted." The message was followed by similar ones from other Team Delta members, all expecting to be fired when they inevitably missed the impossible deadline. Marcus made his decision. He closed his laptop, changed into his best suit, and drove to the Pinnacle building using his executive access card. The 15th floor was bustling with activity despite the late hour. His entire development team was there, surviving on coffee and determination as they fought against mathematics and physics to deliver something that couldn't be delivered. When Marcus stepped off the elevator in his expensive suit, the office fell silent. Employees looked up from their screens with confusion and recognition dawning on their faces. Jennifer Liu was the first to speak. "Wait, aren't you Marcus Johnson from Team Delta? What are you doing here? And why are you dressed like?" Her voice trailed off as understanding hit her. David stood up slowly from his workstation, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally anger. "You're him. You're Marcus Thompson." It wasn't a question. The programming skills that had impressed everyone suddenly made sense. The way he asked probing questions about company culture. His mysterious ability to stay calm during crisis situations. The cheap clothes had been a costume, but the person wearing them had been real. Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yes, I'm Marcus Thompson. And I owe all of you an apology. Actually, I owe you much more than that." He looked around the room at faces that displayed a mixture of shock, betrayal, and curiosity. These weren't just employees anymore. They were colleagues who had accepted him, worked beside him, and shared their honest thoughts about the company he had built. "For the past 6 weeks, I've been working alongside you as Marcus Johnson because I wanted to understand what this company really looked like from your perspective. What I discovered is that I've been a terrible CEO and an even worse leader." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "You've been telling my management team about problems for months, maybe years, but somehow that information never reached me. I created a system where the people doing the actual work had no voice in how that work was planned or executed." Jennifer found her voice first. "So this whole time, you've been listening to us complain about you. To you?" The absurdity of the situation might have been funny under different circumstances, but the room remained tense with uncertainty and exhaustion. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a call that everyone could hear. "Sarah, it's Marcus. Cancel the Megacorp deadline. Tell them we need 2 more weeks to deliver something that actually works, and if they don't like it, we'll refund their money and part ways professionally." He paused, listening to his CFO's protests. "No, this isn't negotiable. We're not destroying our team to meet an impossible deadline that we never should have agreed to in the first place." The relief in the room was palpable, but Marcus wasn't finished. "Everyone go home. Be with your families. Rest. On Monday, we're going to start fixing this company, and I'm going to need all of your help to do it right." The following Monday morning, Marcus called an all-hands meeting in Pinnacle's largest conference room. Word had spread quickly through the company over the weekend about the CEO's undercover operation, and the atmosphere was electric with curiosity, skepticism, and cautious hope. Employees who had never been in the same room as their CEO were now filing in to hear what he had to say about his week spent among them. Marcus stood at the front of the room without his usual PowerPoint presentation or prepared remarks. Instead, he held a thick folder containing 6 weeks of handwritten notes, observations, complaints, suggestions, and insights gathered from the ground level of his own company. The irony wasn't lost on him that this folder contained more useful information about Pinnacle's operations than any consultant report he'd ever commissioned. "I want to start by addressing the obvious question," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. "Why did I lie to you? Why did I pretend to be someone I wasn't?" He paused, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to openly hostile. "The honest answer is that I suspected I was out of touch with this company, but I had no idea how badly I'd failed as a leader until I experienced it myself." He opened his folder and began reading direct quotes, complaints about unrealistic deadlines, frustrations with management decisions, suggestions that had been ignored or dismissed. "These are your words, your insights, your solutions to problems that I didn't even know existed. For 6 weeks, I sat in meetings where my own management team was criticized, rightfully, for making decisions that made your jobs harder and your work less meaningful." The room was silent except for the occasional shuffle of feet or clearing of throat. Marcus could see some employees nodding in recognition of their own comments being read back to them, while others looked uncomfortable at having their private workplace gripes aired so publicly. "David Chen, you told me that you'd never even seen me before, and that I was like a mythical figure who only appeared in company newsletters." Marcus looked directly at David, who was sitting in the third row with his arms crossed. "You were right. I had no idea who you were, what you worked on, or what obstacles you faced every day. That's not leadership, that's negligence. Marcus continued through his notes, addressing specific issues raised by different teams and departments. He acknowledged the marketing team's complaints about being excluded from product decisions. He validated the customer service team's frustrations about managing client expectations that had been set unrealistically by sales. He recognized the facilities staff who worked invisibly to maintain the office amenities that executives took for granted. Jennifer Liu, you told me that executives in this company live in a fantasy world, and that we promise clients things that are physically impossible to deliver. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Marcus continued. You weren't exaggerating. I've spent the last week reviewing our project management processes, and they're a disaster. We've been setting you up to fail, then blaming you for the failures. The mood in the room began to shift as employees realized this wasn't a typical corporate apology tour. Marcus was addressing specific problems with specific acknowledgments of fault, rather than offering vague promises about doing better in the future. Here's what's going to change, starting immediately, Marcus said, pulling out a second folder. First, no more project deadlines will be set without input from the teams doing the actual work. If engineering says something will take 4 weeks, we don't promise clients it'll be done in 2 weeks. Second, we're implementing a formal feedback system that bypasses middle management and comes directly to me. If you have concerns, suggestions, or insights about how this company operates, I want to hear them. He continued with a list of concrete changes: regular town halls where employees could ask questions directly, cross-departmental collaboration teams to improve communication, and a commitment to transparency in decision-making processes. But the biggest change, he announced, would be in his own role. I'm moving my office to the 15th floor, right in the middle of the engineering department. I'll be working alongside you, not above you. The executive suite will be converted into collaborative workspace that everyone can use. The announcement drew surprised murmurs from around the room. I learned more about this company in 6 weeks as Marcus Johnson than I did in 3 years as Marcus Thompson, and I don't intend to lose that perspective again. As the meeting concluded, Marcus felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. He had publicly committed to fundamental changes in how Pinnacle operated, but he knew the real test would be whether he could actually implement them. The employees filing out of the conference room were cautiously optimistic, but decades of corporate disappointments had taught them to judge leaders by actions, not words. 6 months after his undercover revelation, Marcus was debugging code at his new desk in the middle of the engineering floor when Jennifer Liu approached with a problem that would have been handled very differently in the old Pinnacle. A major client was requesting a feature addition that would require significant architectural changes to their core software platform. In the old days, sales would have already promised this to the client with an impossible deadline, Jennifer said, spreading technical specifications across Marcus's desk. But now we can actually discuss whether this is feasible before anyone makes commitments. The change in her tone was remarkable. Gone was the frustrated resignation that Marcus remembered from his undercover days, replaced by professional confidence and collaborative energy. Marcus reviewed the specifications alongside Jennifer and 2 senior developers who had been invited to participate in the initial assessment. This cross-functional approach to project planning was one of many changes that had emerged from his ground-level experience. Instead of executives making promises in isolation, decisions now involved the people who would actually execute the work. This is doable, but it'll require about 12 weeks of development time and some additional infrastructure investments, explained Sarah Kim, the senior developer who had once complained about working 60-hour weeks while her children forgot what she looked like. We can deliver something really solid if we're given adequate time and resources. Marcus nodded, making notes in the same folder he'd carried during his undercover weeks, a habit that had become symbolic of staying connected to ground-level realities. What would you need to make this project successful and sustainable for the team? The question represented a fundamental shift in how Pinnacle approached client work, prioritizing employee well-being alongside business objectives. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. Some executives had resisted the new collaborative approach, arguing that it would slow down decision-making and reduce profitability. Marcus had been forced to make difficult personnel changes, replacing several senior managers who couldn't adapt to a culture that valued employee input over hierarchical authority. The sales director who had dismissed technical concerns so dismissively during Marcus's undercover period was among those who left the company. But the results spoke for themselves. Employee satisfaction scores had increased dramatically, turnover had dropped to record lows, and, perhaps most surprisingly to skeptics, productivity and profitability had both improved. When employees felt heard and valued, they produced better work and stayed with the company longer, reducing recruitment costs and increasing institutional knowledge. David Chen, who had once described Marcus as a mythical figure, was now leading a cross-departmental innovation team that reported directly to the CEO. "It's weird," David admitted during one of their weekly check-ins. "I used to fantasize about telling off the CEO if I ever met him. Now I'm basically texting him bug reports and feature ideas at all hours." The relationship had evolved from adversarial to collaborative, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the company's success. The physical changes in the office reflected the cultural transformation. Marcus's executive suite had been converted into a collaborative workspace with whiteboards, comfortable seating, and video conferencing equipment that any employee could reserve. The executive team now held their meetings in glass-walled conference rooms where their discussions were visible to the entire office, symbolically representing the transparency that had become central to Pinnacle's operations. Marcus had also implemented reverse mentoring programs where junior employees shared their expertise with senior management, recognition systems that celebrated ground-level innovations, and quarterly reality checks, where executives spent time working directly with different departments. The goal was to prevent the kind of leadership isolation that had nearly destroyed the company culture. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus had learned to distinguish between being the boss and being a leader. As the boss, he had made unilateral decisions from his ivory tower, expecting employees to execute his vision without question. As a leader, he facilitated collaborative decision-making, supported his team's professional development, and took responsibility for creating conditions where good work could flourish. The Megacorp project that had nearly broken Team Delta was eventually delivered 3 weeks later than the original impossible deadline, but the quality was so exceptional that Megacorp became one of Pinnacle's biggest advocates, referring multiple new clients and expanding their own contract. The lesson was clear. Sustainable success came from realistic planning and team empowerment, not from pushing people beyond their limits to meet arbitrary deadlines. 2 years after his undercover experiment, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at the National Conference on Corporate Leadership, preparing to share the story that had transformed not just his company, but his entire understanding of what it meant to lead. The audience was filled with CEOs, executives, and business school students eager to learn about Pinnacle's remarkable turnaround and cultural transformation. "How many of you," Marcus began, "really know what it's like to work at your own company?" The question drew chuckles from the audience, but Marcus's expression remained serious. "I thought I knew. I had metrics, surveys, reports, and regular meetings with my management team. But I discovered that all of that information was filtered through so many layers that it bore little resemblance to reality." He clicked to a slide showing 2 photos of the same office space. One from his executive suite perspective, showing a sleek, modern workspace, and another from his undercover desk, revealing the daily stress, collaboration, and genuine dedication that powered the company. These photos were taken from 40 feet apart, but they might as well have been different planets. The presentation continued with concrete examples of changes that had emerged from his ground-level experience. Marcus shared stories about employees whose innovative ideas had been ignored until he experienced the frustration personally, about management decisions that looked rational in boardrooms but created chaos on the work floor, and about the human cost of treating people like resources rather than collaborators. "The most important thing I learned," Marcus explained, "is that great companies aren't built from the top down. They're grown from the ground up by people who care about their work and feel empowered to do it well. My job as CEO isn't to make all the decisions. It's to create conditions where the people closest to the problems can develop and implement solutions." During the Q&A session, a young CEO asked the question that Marcus had been expecting. Wasn't this just an elaborate publicity stunt? How do we know it led to real changes? Marcus had prepared for this skepticism by bringing along several Pinnacle employees who could speak to the transformation from their own perspectives. Jennifer Liu, now promoted to Director of Operations, took the microphone first. 2 years ago, I was updating my resume because I couldn't stand working for a company that didn't value employee expertise. Today, I'm helping design the processes that other tech companies are trying to copy. The change isn't just in Marcus, it's in how the entire organization operates. David Chen followed, sharing his journey from frustrated programmer to innovation team leader. The old Marcus Thompson was a name on my paychecks and a face in company newsletters. The new Marcus Thompson is someone who texts me at weird hours to bounce ideas around and who actually understands the technical challenges we face. That's not a publicity stunt. That's leadership. The presentation concluded with financial metrics that silenced any remaining skeptics. Pinnacle's revenue had grown by 40% over 2 years, employee retention was at an industry-high 96%, and client satisfaction scores had reached unprecedented levels. The company had been recognized as one of the best places to work in tech, and Marcus had been invited to consult with other organizations seeking similar transformations. But for Marcus, the most meaningful change was personal. He no longer dreaded Monday mornings or felt disconnected from the work that bore his name. His days were filled with collaborative problem-solving, mentoring emerging leaders, and contributing directly to the innovations that drove Pinnacle's success. The corner office and executive privileges had been symbols of isolation rather than achievement. As he packed up after his presentation, Marcus reflected on the question that had started his journey. I wonder what our employees really think about this company. He now knew the answer wasn't just in surveys or reports. It was in daily conversations, collaborative decisions, and the trust that developed when leaders worked alongside their teams rather than above them. The undercover experiment had ended, but the leadership transformation it inspired continued every day. Marcus had learned that the best way to understand his company wasn't to spy on his employees, but to work with them as equals in pursuit of shared goals. The pretense of being just another employee had ended, but the authenticity and humility it had taught him became permanent parts of how he led. In the end, Marcus Thompson had discovered that he didn't need to pretend to be an employee. He needed to remember that before he was a CEO, owner, or executive, he was a person who cared about good work, meaningful collaboration, and treating others with respect. That person had never been a pretense. He had just been buried under years of corporate hierarchy and executive isolation. The undercover experiment hadn't changed who he was. It had reminded him who he had always been.